is the Muslim world witnessing the decline of American dominance and the rise of Chinese influence.
The United States is not declining as a power.
I picked this topic because there are rising debates around that East Asia is rising and the West is falling simultaneously.
Can China help them on that? No. China doesn't have the wherewithal to provide or for the needs of these 6 GCC countries. Pakistan's external debt has risen because of the fact that the Chinese investment, the BRI investment in CPEC.
Does this non-interventionist approach make China an attractive partner for Muslim majority states?
This is more wishful thinking than anything else. Russia, especially after the 5 years now of the Ukraine war, has been exposed as a weak power. Turks who are trying to expand into the Persian Gulf.
Hello and welcome to another episode. Our guest today is a renowned geopolitical and foreign policy analyst specializing in global security, the Muslim world, South Asia, and the great power competition. He's also an author, a professor, and a director at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, Washington, D.C. We have with us Mr. Kamran Bokhari. Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Walaikum salam.
Sir, thank you so much for joining. Today, we will discuss one of the biggest geopolitical questions of the 21st century, which is that is the Muslim world witnessing the decline of American dominance and the rise of Chinese influence? So in this regard, my first question to you is that for decades, the United States has been the dominant external power shaping the political and security outcomes across the Muslim world. But in the recent conflicts, do you think that we are now witnessing a genuine shift of influence towards China, or is this transition just being overstated?
Well, thanks for having me. 3 things right off the top. One is we really have to define what do we mean by the Muslim world. If we mean Muslim majority countries, then they're not like a collective, if you will. They're also divided along the natural geographic boundaries, linguistic boundaries, ethnic and national identities, and so on and so forth. So we have to we just can't use the Muslim world and assume that it means something specific. There are many Muslim worlds if we're going to use that term. Second of all, the United States is not declining as a power. I know there's a lot of hype, and then obviously there's a lot of conspiracy theories that are built around the hype. But what is happening, and we can talk about this in greater detail, is a shift in how the United States has been managing the world since it became a superpower at the conclusion of World War II. As for China, it's really overstated. China, yes, is a geoeconomic power, is advancing technologically, but Chinese influence is not there, and it's because of a number of factors. One, the Chinese political economy at home is a drag on the Chinese system. The Chinese growth, the phenomenal growth that we saw for 3 decades, is now a thing of the past. They're not growing the way they used to. They're maturing into, as far as an economic polity is concerned, similar to what happened to Japan in the 90s. So there's a rationalization that is going on over there. And it's no secret that the Chinese do not have, power projection capabilities in a kinetic sense. So I think these are all 3 of the things that you've outlined require, extensive discussion before we can even begin to answer the question that you've posed.
Okay, so first of all, like you asked that what the Muslim world caters to, I guess this is Pakistan, Central Asia to Gulf to the parts of Africa as well. My question exactly to you is that China's rise in the Muslim world, as I mentioned, that from Pakistan to Central Asia to the Gulf and parts of Africa as well, has largely been economic, as you also mentioned, through trade, debt financing, infrastructure, and projects like BRI. But can economic influence alone translate into long-term strategic and political control, especially in the conflict-prone regions like they are currently?
So look, there isn't a necessary pathway from economic influence to I'm assuming strategic and military control,
Yeah.
and the power projection that we have seen from the United States, from the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, and from European states during the colonial era. So there isn't a necessary pathway, and the Chinese political economic model is as such that it's very unique. It's very fragile. It's based on single party rule, and it imposes constraints on how far China can go. If you look at just the BRI project, for example,
Yeah.
and Pakistan's China, the Pakistan China-Pakistan economic corridor is sort of the signature project within the BRI. And so if you look at it and then you look at how where else has this taken place, you notice a pattern. The pattern is China goes into countries that are, we can say, strategically malleable. In other words, they require external assistance, economic assistance for their own well-being. And that allows the Chinese to come in and do what they need to do. But what happens is that the influx of cash does not necessarily drive the engines of these countries. So, for example, Sri Lanka and the default over there. You look
Yeah.
at what happened in Zambia, a country like Zambia, where the Chinese footprint was significant. You look at Pakistan. We Pakistan's external debt has risen because of the fact that the Chinese investment, the BRI investment in CPEC. And so what happens is that these China comes into these countries, uh, does what it needs to do, builds infrastructure, and but the problem is the countries do not take off. In other words, these countries become further indebted. They don't the original purpose of Chinese assistance is not achieved. Okay, and you're far worse off. And you see that Pakistan is constantly asking the Chinese for rolling over loans. And so, in other words, the idea is if someone invests money, then in a country, if China invests money in a country, that country should be able to fire up its economic engine and be able to
Yes.
produce, and then be able to allow for Chinese influence, but also China should be able to reap its investment. The return on investment is not there. So this
Mm.
is something that the Chinese are still grappling with. And then, if you look in Central Asia, there's a lot of pushback. I mean, there's a pushback from a country like Kazakhstan that does not want to go from being, if you will, under the influence of the Kremlin to becoming, if you will, a sphere of influence for Beijing. So, and these countries are rising middle powers as well. I mean, countries like Kazakhstan is a prime example. Others, who are smaller, like Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, they're far more vulnerable because they're much more their economic output is nowhere near that of Kazakhstan. And of course, there's countries in the middle, Uzbekistan, who are not as small economies as the other three I mentioned, but they're not the Kazakhstans of this world either. So there's a whole lot of granularity and nuance here that needs to be picked apart.
Okay. Today, I picked this topic because there are rising debates around that East Asia is rising and the West is falling simultaneously. So my whole debate will be in order to clear all those doubts. Uh, Before moving on to the next question, a little off-topic question is that the Indo-Middle East Europe Economic Corridor is often being framed as a geopolitical alternative to CPEC and even as a part of a wider effort to counter China's BRI. Do you see these connectivity projects as purely economic corridors, or are they becoming the infrastructure front lines of a much larger strategic competition?
So of course, the basis of strategic competition is economics, is geoeconomics. So, and that's a function of trade and commerce on the high seas. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, we can't separate the two out. The two are intrinsically linked. As
Yes.
for the IMEC project, I think this is something that needs to be sort of reevaluated in the light of what has happened since it was first announced by the Biden administration. And the
Yes.
idea was not to counter China so much, but to develop sort of a linkage, a connectivity between India, which is a rising economy, uh, and basically connecting it to the Middle East, to the Arab world, and from there connecting it to Europe, essentially using the Northwest Indian Ocean basin overland through the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant through the Mediterranean Sea off to southern Europe. So that was sort of the concept there. Now, the question is, oh, what has happened more recently? What has happened more recently is the war with Iran. And the
Yes.
war with Iran has created new realities. The new reality is that, from the point of view of the Arab states, they don't want to be so dependent anymore. This is now an imperative of theirs on the Persian Gulf as a waterway. Some states
Okay.
have far more leverage, like Saudi Arabia, with its east-west pipeline that runs from the eastern province along the Persian Gulf all the way to the port of Yanbu, which is on the Red Sea on the other side of the country. Likewise, UAE has that pipeline through Fujairah that bypasses the Straits of Hormuz and allows for an export terminal that opens up on the Arabian Sea, essentially the Northwest Indian Ocean. And so those countries, these two countries, obviously are also the bigger economies in the region. And therefore, they have the ability to, they built this as a redundancy in anticipation of a potential conflict. Now that that conflict has happened, you can definitely expect these countries to try and really minimize their dependency on the Persian Gulf. And therefore, IMEC becomes the concept of IMEC. IMEC doesn't exist right now in sort of like in a full form, just as BRI is in development. IMEC is a concept. So IMEC as a concept becomes very interesting. How do you use that IMEC concept to help reduce dependency of these countries on the Persian Gulf as a medium through which you export your main commodity, which is energy, oil and gas. Now, the countries like Kuwait, which are at sort of the cul-de-sac of the Persian Gulf, are in a bit of a bind. They don't have any other way to export other than through the Strait of Hormuz. Likewise, Iraq needs this waterway. And of course, Iran, obviously, Iran has no other way because it's on the other side of the Persian Gulf. And then Qatar, the LNG facility, the world's largest LNG producer, has its facilities that depend on uh, the Strait of Hormuz being navigable and open and free. So I suspect that the concept of IMEC moving forward will be sort of a template to sort of rejigger how trade flows and energy exports go through this region to the rest of the world. So I suspect that, Kuwait and Bahrain, because of their close relationship with Saudi Arabia, will somehow make use of Saudi Arabia as a corridor for connecting to the rest of the world. Likewise, the Turks who are trying to expand into the Persian Gulf, as something historically the Turks have not had access to. Uh, they're trying to take advantage of the weakening of Iran and establish a maritime presence there. They already have a military base of sorts in Qatar with 3,000 troops on the ground. And so Turkey has an interest in trying to steer Iraq into a different direction, into its orbit away from Iran. And therefore, you can see how the relationship with the Kurds, and it's not really clear what will happen to sort of the Shia, communities of Iraq and what will their share of power be moving forward, given the decline of influence and capabilities of Iran, because they've depended on Iran for so long. So I think that you'll see sort of that, oil being exported through the north, through the Kurdish areas, and through Turkey and then on to the international markets. So these are all concepts that we will see, unfold in the years to come.
Okay. So coming back to the discussion of the influence of greater powers on the Muslim world, unlike Washington, Beijing avoids military entanglements and ideological positioning. Does this non-interventionist approach make China an attractive partner for Muslim majority states, or does it just limit its ability to shape outcomes on the ground?
Again, we're going to have to talk about which Muslim majority states because uh, let's look at the Gulf countries, just for an example, the six Gulf
Okay.
countries.
Yeah.
There is no way that they can depend on China because China does not protect power, but they have an imperative to protect themselves from not just Iran as an adversary, especially after this war, but also overbearing influence from Turkey and in ensuring that Israel is managed. Okay. So how do they do that? Can China help them on that? No, China doesn't have the wherewithal to provide or for the needs of these six GCC countries. So they will continue to work with the United States. They have no other option. Uh, there is also something that needs to be understood here is that the United States is shifting away from doing all the heavy lifting that it has been from the end of World War II to the present. The new geostrategy of the United States for global management is one built on burden sharing and burden shifting, those two concepts. Essentially, the United States is saying, we'll do the heavy lifting in the Western Hemisphere, from Greenland all the way to the Falkland Islands and the two North and South American continents. And the waterways, the Pacific and the Atlantic, Eurasia and Africa,
Hmm.
these have to be managed by allied and partner nations. And so in
Okay.
a time like that, it's no surprise that you see like a country like Saudi Arabia saying, well, I can only depend on the Americans for so much. So let me bring Pakistan into this equation. And so therefore the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement with Pakistan last fall. And so that's just to give you one example. The Americans are also trying to sort of say to the Saudis that you need to work with Turkey, you need to work with Israel, and of course you can bring Pakistan in as well, but we need some form of a new architecture. So first, the United States is not. They have no choice but to still work with the United States. Second, they need to be able to share that burden with the United States, cannot rely on the United States to do everything for them, as has been the case in the past, which was unique to that era and is no longer necessary and is not something that the United States wants to expend its resources on. But then you have the Chinese factor. What can China do? Let me just give you a very recent example of the overhype of Chinese influence. So in March of 2023, there was a ceremony involving senior officials between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Beijing restoring diplomatic relations. And it was seen as this big thing, and everybody thought that, the headlines were the United States is declining power in the Middle East and China is the rising power. But there were many of us who said at that point in time that this is not true because this is more wishful thinking than anything else. And we laid out the arguments. What happened after that? That was March of 2023.
Okay.
Both the Saudis and the Iranians weren't actually becoming friends. They were just cooling temperatures down. Meanwhile, the Saudis were in negotiations with the Israelis on the Abraham Accords. And the Iranians were working with Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis for the October 7 attack that took place in late 2023. And so that shows you the limits of how much China can influence anything. The reality was there was just a ribbon cutting ceremony. The mediation between the Saudis and the Iranians was done through Oman and Iraq. So the Chinese just decided to have that ceremony there, and everybody made a big deal out of it. So this is not how influence is gained. Influence is a function of hard power. It's not an influence, a function of soft power where you have diplomacy and this and that. And economic assistance also needs to be sort of examined. What kind of economic existence? Look, China depends on this region for its energy needs, for its oil needs, and therefore that's why they're playing in this theater. That doesn't mean that China has the wherewithal to shape the outcome of what's happening in the Middle East.
Okay, so this tells me that the Middle East will keep trusting America because that's the only hard power in comparison to China and Russia.
It's not about trust. There's very
Okay,
little trust in geopolitics. It's about who can deliver, who can serve your interests in a verifiable way.
okay. So finally, if we look ahead to the next decade, do you see the Muslim majority states or the greater Muslim world emerging as an independent geopolitical pole, or will it remain a space where major powers like the US, China, or Russia compete for influence without a coherent regional agency?
I think it'll be neither. I think that what we're still going by the old framework. When we pose that question of whether the Muslim world will appear as a this is an aspiration in the Muslim world that
Yeah.
they become this player on the global stage. On the other hand, there's okay, will it continue to be a arena for competition between great powers? So let's examine both. As I said earlier, uh, even if you look at the battle box of the Middle East, you have two powers, two Muslim majority powers trying to influence the Middle East, Iran and Turkey. Okay. So, and then Saudi Arabia is there as well, and Pakistan is being pulled into this dynamic more
Mm,
recently.
yeah.
So you don't have a pole. There is no pole. Okay.
Okay.
And this is why the whole concept of multipolarity is sort of like a recycling, and I find it intellectual laziness because this is a recycling of the original term bipolar or bipolarity, which
Okay.
was real because there were two competing superpowers right after the end of World War II, through to whom many states gravitated. And the Soviet Union had allies in Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union had allies around the world, in all regions of the world. And therefore, it was a competition. There was a competition between two different political economic systems. Since the end of that competition, we've started to say multipolarity, that there are going to be multiple poles. But what are those multiple poles? Russia, especially after the 4 or 5 years now of the Ukraine war, has been exposed as a weak power. It's not the great power that it used to be. China, on the other hand, is not a pole. Nobody is gravitating to China. Nobody's emulating the Chinese model. That they're using China or they're relying on China to help them in economic sense. But nobody's saying, hey, let's go and, if you will, adopt the Chinese political economic system because it's not even working in China. So I think that there's a need to understand that. I think what is going to happen as the United States reduces its exposure and its footprint around the world in this new sort of geostrategy and rolls out and it's something the United States will have to work on because this isn't this isn't like unlike a movie where you have a script and choreography in real geopolitics, actors, even the most powerful ones, have to make things up as they go along. They have concepts, they have broad principles, they have broad strategies. They have to be worked out over time. And as you operationalize them, you run into problems, and then you have to resolve those problems. So I think that that process will play itself out. I don't think that there's going to be a competition with China in that sense. China will continue to play a geoeconomic role in not just Muslim majority countries, but around the world in general. So China and the United States are geoeconomic competitors. That'll continue. But as far as this region of the world is concerned, Central Asia, South Asia, Middle East, South Caucasus, the land between the lands between the Mediterranean, the Red, the Black, the Caspian, and the Arabian Seas. I think that this and the broader Indian Ocean basin, this region will see the emergence of middle powers that will either work together or conflict with each other. And therefore, that to me seems like a more reasonable, if you will, outlook for the future. So if the United States is saying, we need you to take the lead, Turkey is taking the lead, it'll have to work out a relationship with Saudi. Saudi is bringing Pakistan in, and then all three of these will have to somehow work with Israel. And then there's the unanswered question of what is the future of Iran, because the Iran has to go through an internal evolution that's been accelerated by this war. And so we don't really know. So I think if we're going to use the old terminology and the old lenses of trying to understand what will hold in the future, what does the future hold for us around the world, I think we're not going to make a whole lot of headway. We have to sort of look at the here and now through different lenses. In other words, we have to adjust our viewfinders.
Okay. Sir, thank you so much. This debate clears most of our doubts regarding the emerging global order.
Thank you
Thank you
for
so much
having me.
for your time. Thank you.
Cheers.